Imagine a modern game of Monopoly, where the railroads and utilities are replaced by endless rows of cornfields and potato farms. One player, a tech billionaire, is quietly buying up properties, not on Park Place or Broadway, but across America's heartland. It sounds like a strange plot twist. The man who gave the world Microsoft Office is now staking claims in fertile soil. Yet this is no game or fiction. It's the real story of Bill Gates becoming the largest private farmland owner in the United States. Just as old tycoons hoarded oil fields, Gates is accumulating farmland in a way that has observers scratching their heads. Is it a savvy investment, a bid to influence the future of food, or something else entirely? Why, of all things, is Bill Gates buying up so much farmland in America? What does Farmer Bill really want with all this land, and what could it mean for our food and future? To understand the intrigue, let's start with the man himself. Bill Gates is best known as the co-founder of Microsoft, the software pioneer who became one of the richest people on the planet. For decades, he dominated the tech industry, turning an Albuquerque garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. With that success came immense wealth, over $100 billion in net worth, and a global influence that few individuals have ever achieved. In the 2000s, Gates stepped back from day-to-day tech work and refashioned himself as a philanthropist. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he's poured his fortune into tackling big challenges like global health, education, and climate change. In short, Bill Gates has been a software developer, a business magnate, and a world-changing philanthropist. What he has never been, at least until recently, is a farmer. Gates grew up in Seattle, far from any rural farm life, and he made his name in bites, not bushels. That's why news that Bill Gates had quietly become the largest private owner of U.S. farmland came as such a surprise. The man famous for computers and vaccines suddenly had an alter ego. Farmer Bill, an unlikely title for a tech billionaire. So how did a city-born software titan end up holding vast stretches of American farmland? And more importantly, why is he doing it? Bill Gates did not wake up one day and purchase a single giant farm. His land acquisition has been a steady, below-the-radar process over the past decade. According to an in-depth investigation by The Land Report, Gates, often via a personal investment firm called Cascade Investment LLC, has amassed approximately 242,000 acres of U.S. farmland. Other estimates, including more recent counts, put his total farmland ownership even higher, on the order of 268,000 to 270,000 acres spread over 18 to 19 states. To put that in perspective, that's an area nearly the size of Hong Kong devoted entirely to agriculture. It's only about 1/40,000th of all U.S. farmland, nowhere near the outrageous 80% figure some internet rumors have claimed, but it's still enough to make Gates the #1 private farmland owner in America. The typical U.S. farm is around 444 acres, so Gates's holdings equate to hundreds of average farms put together. The purchases themselves were often shrouded in secrecy. Gates didn't advertise these deals. Instead, many were done quietly through shell companies and third-party entities. One of the first clues came in 2018, when a local news report in Washington state uncovered that a company linked to Gates had paid $171 million for a swath of rich farmland in the Columbia River Basin. That single purchase was an eye-popping 14,500-acre tract known as 100 Circles Farm, named for its distinctive pattern of circular irrigated fields, a huge property in Benton County, Washington. It set off alarm bells and spurred reporters to dig deeper, eventually revealing the scope of Gates's agricultural portfolio. Satellite view of the 100 Circle Farm in Washington state, one of Gates's major acquisitions, so named for the dozens of circular crop fields created by pivot irrigation systems. In 2018, a Gates-associated trust purchased roughly 14,500 acres in this area for about $171 million, exemplifying the scale of his farmland investments. By 2020, the secret was out. Bill Gates had become a massive farmland investor. The purchases range from fertile cornfields in Nebraska to soybean and rice farms in Louisiana to carrot and potato land in Florida, a diversified spread across multiple states. In late 2022, he even bought a 2,100-acre potato farm in North Dakota for $13.5 million. That deal made headlines not only for its size, but because local residents were stunned that one of the world's richest men was now their neighbor, in a sense, owning fields that locals had tended for generations. Gates typically doesn't farm these lands himself. Instead, he acts as a landlord, leasing the fields to actual farmers who continue to grow crops on them. In other words, you won't see Bill Gates driving a tractor at harvest time. This is an investment, not a hobby, and it was done quietly, even secretly, as one agriculture outlet put it, until investigative journalists traced the paper trail. So why is he doing this? Gates himself gave one straightforward explanation. Farmland is a smart, long-term investment. There's an old saying in real estate, buy land. They aren't making it anymore. Indeed, productive farmland is a finite resource, and its value has historically been on the rise. Farmland offers steady appreciation with low volatility, making it attractive to savvy investors. Statistics back this up. From 1940 to 2015, the average U.S. farmland price increased about six-fold, even after adjusting for inflation. Despite economic ups and downs, farmland tends to hold value and even climb, in part because people will always need food. Gates and other ultra-rich buyers noticed that farmland can serve as a stable store of wealth, like gold with an added annual yield. In recent years, traditional safe havens, like bonds, offered low returns, especially following the 2008 financial crisis, so billionaires turned to alternative assets. Agricultural land became a hot commodity in the investment world when other markets looked risky. It doesn't hurt that farmland can generate cash rent each year and potentially qualify for various crop insurance and subsidy programs, which reduce risk for owners. In short, farmland provides income, capital appreciation, and a hedge against inflation, an enticing combination for any investor, let alone one with billions to deploy. Bill Gates has explicitly downplayed any secret agenda behind his farmland spree, framing it as a pragmatic decision. During a public Reddit Ask Me Anything AMA session in early 2021, someone flat out asked him, "Hey Bill, why are you buying so much farmland?" Gates answered, "My investment group chose to do this. It is not connected to climate." In other words, he suggested it's simply a good investment opportunity, not part of some grand eco-scheme. Good, solid investment is how one Gates spokesperson described the land buys. The idea is echoed by agriculture analysts who note that wealthy individuals and even corporations have been pouring money into farmland as an asset class for years. About 97% of American farms are still family-owned, but that remaining 3% includes a growing share held by investors, agribusinesses, and millionaires looking for stable returns. Gates is simply one of the biggest and newest players in this trend of farmfluencers, influential investors betting on the land that feeds us. Yet the investment rationale is only part of the story. Bill Gates's explanation, not connected to climate, raised as many questions as it answered. If profit alone is the motive, why would a tech billionaire choose farmland over, say, more tech companies or conventional stocks? This is where we start looking at the bigger picture and Gates's possible long-term goals. In that same AMA response, right after saying it wasn't directly a climate initiative, Gates did mention something intriguing. He noted that the agriculture sector is important and hinted at the potential of more productive seeds and cheap biofuels as reasons behind the purchases. It was a glimpse into a forward-looking strategy. Gates, with his characteristic big-picture thinking, seems to view farmland as more than just dirt and crops. It's a platform for innovation and a strategic asset for the future of food and energy. Let's delve deeper into those potential motivations. P. Intellectual property that farmers rely on. There's no hard proof that this is Gates's intent, but it's a narrative gaining traction among skeptics of big tech's incursion into agriculture. Gates, for his part, has advocated for things like rich countries shifting to 100% synthetic beef to reduce emissions. He openly asks wealthy nations to consume plant-based or lab-grown meat instead of livestock beef, which aligns with his investments in Impossible Foods, et al. If that vision came true, it would indeed reshape farming. Less cattle ranching, perhaps more cultivation of plant protein crops or bioengineered feedstock. A U.S. congressman, Representative Dusty Johnson, even remarked that Gates's stance on synthetic meat raises questions about his land purchases. How are his land purchases related to those aspirations? Johnson suggested that if Gates thinks Americans should eat less real beef, owning so much farmland, some of which likely produces cattle feed or could be used for grazing, is curious and worth examining. This hints that Gates's long-term goals might indeed include influencing agricultural production choices, possibly favoring crops for plant-based proteins or biofuels over traditional uses like animal feed. Though again, this is largely speculative at this stage. In summary, Bill Gates's long-term vision with his farmland empire seems to straddle both altruistic and strategic motives. He undeniably has a passion for innovation and sustainability, seeing technological advances in farming as key to solving global problems. By owning land, he gains a foothold in the very domain he wants to innovate. But at the same time, owning that much land also positions him to benefit from any changes he helps usher in, whether it's the rise of super crops, biofuels, or alternative meats. It's a classic Gates move. Think decades ahead, invest accordingly, and be ready for the seismic shifts before they happen. However, This move isn't happening in a vacuum. It has real-world consequences and has sparked real concerns among ordinary farmers and the general public, which we explore next. When one man, or any one entity, accumulates 250,000 acres of farmland, it's bound to have ripple effects. How does Bill Gates's land grab affect everyday people, especially farmers, consumers, and local communities? The answers are a mix of potential benefits and worries. On the optimistic side, if Gates indeed champions sustainable practices on his farms, it could drive broader adoption of environmentally friendly agriculture. Imagine if all his leased farms started rotating crops, planting cover crops, reducing tillage, or cutting fertilizer runoff. He could indirectly improve soil health and water quality on a significant chunk of land, setting an example for others. Additionally, his funding for research and new farming technologies could yield breakthroughs that benefit growers everywhere, from better drought-resistant seeds to precision irrigation systems that save water. Gates's involvement brings attention and capital to agriculture, a sector often overlooked by Silicon Valley. That attention could spur more innovation and potentially make farming more efficient and climate resilient, which in the long run helps ensure a stable food supply for the population. However, much of the on-the-ground impact so far appears to be raising eyebrows and concerns. Let's start with farmers, particularly small and medium-scale farmers. For decades, they have struggled with thin profit margins, rising costs, and competition from big agribusiness. Now, add wealthy investors buying up land to the list of challenges. As Gates and other investors purchase farmland, they often drive up land prices, making it harder for young or less wealthy farmers to afford land of their own. Land is the fundamental asset in farming. If you can't buy or rent it at a reasonable price, you can't farm. Farmland values have been soaring in many regions. From 2017 to 2022, average U.S. farm real estate prices jumped about 23%, from roughly $4,300 to $5,350 per acre, with even sharper spikes, over 30% increases, in counties that saw a big drop in the number of farmers. Those statistics tell a story. Where land got a lot more expensive, many farmers disappeared, often retiring early or selling out because they couldn't keep up. The culprits behind rising prices include development pressure, urban sprawl eating into farmland, and new uses like solar farms, but also deep-pocketed investors and corporations paying top dollar for agricultural land. When billionaires like Gates enter the scene, they can typically outbid local farmers. They have cash on hand and are willing to pay a premium for large tracts, seeing it as a long-term investment. An investigative report in 2024 noted that large investment firms and institutional buyers have been snapping up property and in some cases reselling it at prices 5 times higher than the local average, effectively pricing out would-be farming families. As one representative of the National Young Farmers Coalition put it, today, the biggest threat we see for accessing farmland is from corporations and hedge funds. While Bill Gates is not a hedge fund, from a local farmer's perspective, he might as well be. He represents big money coming into the market. If a retiring farmer has 2 offers, one from a neighbor's family and one from Gates's investment managers, the latter might be higher. The neighbor loses the chance to expand, and another piece of land shifts from a community owner to a remote owner. Over time, this trend could concentrate land ownership and weaken rural community ties. Fewer farmers owning land means fewer folks with a stake in each small town's schools, feed stores, and local economy. There's also a symbolic weight to farmland ownership. In America, farmland is more than an asset. It's often a family's heritage, a community's identity, even part of the national mythos of self-reliance. Seeing so much of it in the hands of someone who's not a farmer and who's one of the richest men alive makes people uneasy. It raises the specter of a new Gilded Age where land, the original source of wealth, is increasingly owned by the ultra-wealthy, not by the people who actually work it. This isn't just a theoretical worry. When Gates's purchases became public, some farmers and commentators voiced fears that big tech billionaires were going to gobble up rural America next, just as tech oligopolies have dominated other industries. In North Dakota, news of Gates buying that potato farm sparked outrage. The state's agriculture commissioner said people were upset and livid at the idea. North Dakota has a proud tradition of family farms, protected by an anti-corporate farming law, So the notion of an out-of-state trust controlled by Gates owning their land was almost heresy. Gates had to assure authorities he would lease the land to local farmers, which appeased the law and hopefully some locals. But the episode underscored how communities react when farmland, their literal backyard, is sold to a faceless investment entity linked to a famous outsider. For consumers and the general population, one could argue that who owns farmland might eventually affect what ends up on our plates. For now, Gates's ownership hasn't changed what these farms produce. He isn't dictating crop choices on his leased lands. If a farm grew potatoes before, it still grows potatoes now, just with a different landlord. There's evidence that Gates has not, yet, attempted to change farming practices on his lands. He's let professional farmers continue business as usual. Some of those usual practices, critics note, include heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides or planting the same commodity crops year after year, the very things sustainability advocates want to improve. So in the short term, the environmental impact of Gates's ownership might be neutral or even negative if those farms continue any environmentally harmful practices under a landlord primarily focused on steady returns. Owning farmland doesn't automatically make it greener. If profit is the main goal, there might be little incentive to invest in conservation unless it also boosts long-term yields or land value. The public, of course, would like to see better stewards of the land. Many wonder, will Gates use his position to push for greener agriculture or just collect rent from conventional farming that sometimes pollutes soil and water? That remains to be seen. Looking further ahead, if Gates's influence in agriculture grows, he could indirectly shape food policy and market trends, for better or worse. For instance, given his advocacy for plant-based diets to combat climate change, one could imagine him encouraging more of his farmland to be used for crops like peas, soy, or other protein-rich plants that supply the alt-meat industry. If he ever did so, it might subtly shift land use away from feed corn or cow pasture towards these new priorities. If a significant number of large owners followed suit, especially with Gates being a trendsetter, it could alter the agricultural landscape. Perhaps less cattle, more legumes. To the everyday consumer, that might mean more availability of, and perhaps lower prices for, plant-based foods, but possibly higher prices for beef or other products if their production land shrinks. Is there a master plan behind Bill Gates's farm purchases? While he hasn't published a manifesto on the matter, clues from his public statements and investments suggest a vision that goes beyond simply collecting rent checks. One theory is that Gates is positioning himself at the forefront of an agricultural revolution, one that merges technology, sustainability, and food security. Think of it as the agri-tech angle. Owning farmland could give Gates a living laboratory to implement new farming techniques, seed varieties, and green energy innovations on a large scale. In his 2021 Reddit AMA, after clarifying that the land buys weren't directly about climate change, Gates elaborated, "The agriculture sector is important. With more productive seeds, we can avoid deforestation and help Africa deal with the climate difficulty they already face. It is unclear how cheap biofuels can be, but if they are cheap, it can solve the aviation and truck emissions." This single quote is telling. Gates is pointing to seed science and biofuel development as key motivators. In essence, he's interested in boosting agricultural productivity, e.g., through better seeds, and exploring sustainable fuels, like biofuels, that could cut carbon emissions from transportation. Both goals align with global challenges, feeding a growing population without destroying forests, and fighting climate change by decarbonizing fuel. By investing in farmland, Gates has a stake in the very industries, farming and bioenergy, where these innovations need to take root. It's no coincidence that around the same time, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched an initiative called Gates Ag 1 to promote agricultural innovation for small farmers in poor countries. Gates Ag 1, announced in 2020, focuses on developing affordable tools and high-yield crops to help farmers in Africa and Asia adapt to climate change. While Gates's personal U.S. farmland holdings are separate from his foundation's nonprofit work, the philosophy is consistent. He believes science and technology, like improved crop genetics and advanced farming methods, are key to the future of agriculture. Owning farmland in the U.S. could indirectly support that vision. For example, American farms could serve as testing grounds for new seeds or techniques that might later benefit farmers worldwide. In a blog discussing Gates's land buys, one analysis noted that as a well-known philanthropist concerned with global food security, Gates might be betting that the next advancements in seed technology will be furthered on American farms. If you control some of those farms, or at least have close partnerships with them, you can accelerate innovation. Consider seed science. Traditional farmers plant what they know works. Gates, on the other hand, can invest in R&D for supercrops, genetically improved seeds that yield more food on the same acreage. More productive seeds mean you can grow more without needing to clear additional forests for farmland, hence avoiding deforestation. Gates explicitly mentioned that better seeds might help prevent the destruction of rainforests for agriculture and could help regions like Africa grow enough food despite climate pressures. This dovetails with his climate change concerns. In his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, Gates talks about how agriculture is both vulnerable to climate change and a contributor to it. Through methane from cattle, CO2 from land use, etc., owning farmland could give him a sandbox to implement climate-friendly farming. For instance, experimenting with crops that use less water or require less fertilizer, or farming practices that capture carbon in the soil. We know that Cascade Investment, the firm managing Gates's personal wealth, has said it is very supportive of sustainable farming. Cascade even helped start an initiative called Leading Harvest to establish sustainability standards across millions of acres of farmland. It's plausible that Gates's farms might adopt these standards, potentially becoming models of eco-friendly agriculture. While day-to-day, he lets professional farmers run the operations. As the owner, he could influence practices over time. For example, mandating crop rotation, soil conservation, or cutting-edge precision farming tech to reduce chemical use. Then there's the biofuel angle. Gates brought up biofuels in that AMA answer, noting the potential to solve emissions for aviation and trucking if biofuels become cheap and efficient. Biofuels are fuels derived from crops, like ethanol from corn or biodiesel from soybeans. By owning farmland, Gates has a direct interest in the feedstocks for bioenergy. If a breakthrough makes, say, algae-based fuel viable, owning land and water rights could prove extremely valuable. Some observers speculate that part of his strategy is to be positioned for the day when farm-grown energy really takes off. In a world worried about running out of oil, farmland that produces renewable fuel could be the new oil well. At the very least, it's a hedge. If electric vehicles and solar power don't fully replace fossil fuels fast enough, society may lean more on biofuels, which means more demand for crops like corn and potentially higher value for farmland. Gates is essentially covering his bases in the future energy game by having a foot in agriculture. Beyond what Gates himself has said, let's consider his other investments and how they align with a grander food and farm vision. Through Cascade and related funds, Gates has invested in cutting-edge agri-food companies. He's a shareholder in Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, the famous plant-based protein companies creating meat alternatives. He has also put money into John Deere, the iconic farm equipment maker that's now pushing AI and robotics in farming. Moreover, Gates spearheads Breakthrough Energy Ventures, a climate-focused investment fund that backs startups in areas like synthetic fertilizers and agricultural data. For example, Breakthrough Energy has funded Pivot Bio, which develops microbes to naturally fertilize soil, reducing the need for synthetic nitrogen. It's also invested in food innovation firms like Motif Foodworks, for plant-based ingredients, and agitech platforms like CropX or Cropin that digitize farm management. All these pieces form a mosaic. They suggest Gates envisions a tech-driven transformation of agriculture, from how we grow crops to what we eat, and he's putting his money on multiple fronts to make sure he's part of that transformation. Owning farmland adds yet another dimension. As one farm policy advocate observed, following the money, it's clear that Gates prioritizes technological solutions over traditional farmer-led practices. With so many stakes in agtech and now a large swath of actual agricultural land, Gates could potentially integrate these interests. For example, his farms might one day pilot a new nitrogen-fixing crop technology from Pivot Bio, or dedicate some acreage to grow yellow peas, a key ingredient in plant-based meat, to supply companies like Beyond Meat, in which he's invested. While no public evidence yet shows him restructuring his farms to serve these high-tech purposes, the synergy is hard to ignore. Not everyone is convinced that Gates's intentions are benign. Whenever a powerful figure accumulates resources as fundamental as land, conspiracy theories and skepticism abound. In Gates's case, there are polar opposite interpretations of his endgame. On one hand, some view him as a forward-thinking benefactor. By owning farmland, he can promote sustainable farming practices, invest in R&D, and ensure that vital agricultural agricultural assets aren't solely in the hands of profit-driven corporations or foreign governments. In other words, better Gates than, say, absentee investors with no interest in innovation or the public good. On the other hand, critics suspect a more strategic power grab. They argue that Gates might be trying to monopolize aspects of the food supply chain, just as he once dominated the software market. A recent book by investigative journalist Seamus Bruner claims that Gates's investments in patented seeds, synthetic fertilizers, lab-grown meats, and farmland all point to an attempt to control global food production under the guise of climate activism. The book and its supporters posit that controlling farmland and promoting fake meat could give Gates and his peers influence over what people eat and how food is produced, ultimately enriching those investors. Fake meats are about controlling the food market, not saving the planet, Bruner told Fox News Digital. He draws parallels to the Rockefellers, who funded the original Green Revolution in agriculture decades ago. That effort boosted yields worldwide, but also led to reliance on patented seeds and chemical fertilizers, benefiting big agribusiness at the expense of small farmers. Bruner and others warn that Gates could be advancing a similar paradigm, pushing high-tech fixes, like genetically engineered supercrops or proprietary meat alternatives, that make him richer and potentially concentrate power, all while framing it as philanthropy or sustainability. It's a dramatic theory. Gates is a sort of food control oligarch who wants to own not just the farms, but the IP, intellectual property, that farmers rely on. There's no hard proof that this is Gates's intent, but it's a narrative gaining traction among skeptics of big tech's incursion into agriculture. Gates, for his part, has advocated for things like rich countries shifting to 100% synthetic beef to reduce emissions, fumes. To the everyday consumer, that might mean more availability of, and perhaps lower prices for, plant-based foods, but possibly higher prices for beef or other products if their production land shrinks. This is speculative, but not implausible given Gates's public positions. Critics like Representative Johnson have openly mused about this. Gates says rich countries should quit beef, and at the same time he's buying up farmland. Could he be planning to push our food system in that direction? If yes, there could be a clash between billionaire-driven food trends and traditional dietary preferences or livelihoods, like cattle ranching. The population might find their food choices nudged not just by market forces, but by the vision of powerful investors. Another consequence to consider is the political power that comes with owning critical resources. Farmers often have a voice in policy, through farm bureaus, etc. But if more land is owned by a few billionaires or corporations, will those owners wield greater influence in Washington? Gates is already a heavyweight in policy circles due to his philanthropy and tech legacy. With farming interests, he or his representatives might engage in debates on farm subsidies, land use regulations, or agricultural research funding. Some watchdog groups express concern that one person accumulating so much land could lead to outsized sway over agricultural policy, potentially tilting it toward large-scale, tech-centric farming solutions and away from small farmer interests. For example, if Gates advocated for certain climate-related agricultural regulations, lawmakers might listen, given his prominence. In one striking development, Congressman Dusty Johnson actually called for Gates to testify before Congress about his farmland holdings. Johnson argued that the House Agriculture Committee should not ignore the fact that so much U.S. land is in Gates's hands and wanted to hear what Gates plans to do with it. Essentially, there's a fear of the unknown. How might Gates's ownership affect food prices, land access, or farm policy in the future? Johnson's request hints that even policymakers see this as a matter of public interest, not just a private portfolio choice. If Gates's land strategy were ever perceived as harming the public, say driving up food prices or undermining small farms, there could be regulatory backlash. For now, it's mostly speculation and anxiety, but the population is watching Farmer Bill carefully, looking for signs of what his land ownership means for everyone else. From Bill Gates's perspective, the benefits of buying U.S. farmland are both tangible and strategic. Financially, it's a classic win-win asset. Farmland produces crops that can be sold for income, or rents paid by tenant farmers, and over time, the land itself generally increases in value. As we noted earlier, farmland values have trended upward significantly over the decades. By diversifying into agriculture, Gates spreads out his wealth into an asset class that doesn't move in tandem with tech stocks or real estate markets, providing a cushion against economic volatility. In years when the stock market is shaky, owning a few 100,000 acres of corn and soybean fields can be surprisingly comforting. Crops still grow, people still need to eat, and farmland tends to hold its worth. Low volatility is a key benefit. Many investors seek uncorrelated assets, and farmland historically doesn't swing wildly in value from year to year. This stability is especially appealing for someone of Gates's net worth. He's not looking for a quick flip or a speculative spike. He wants to park some wealth in a secure, long-term store. Farmland serves that role well, akin to treasury bonds, but with higher returns. In fact, some studies have shown that over the long run, farmland can yield returns comparable to stocks, once you account for crop income and land appreciation, all while being far less volatile than the stock market. Another financial perk: tax advantages and subsidies. The U.S. agricultural system provides various supports that, indirectly, can end up benefiting landowners. For example, the federal government heavily subsidizes crop insurance for farmers, covering losses from bad weather or market crashes. These subsidies have no income limit, meaning even billionaires' farms are eligible. If a farmer leasing Gates's land gets a crop insurance payout in a bad year, that farmer can still pay rent to Gates. Effectively, taxpayer money helps guarantee Gates's rental income. It's an ironic situation where an initiative meant to protect small farmers can also pad the returns of a mega landlord, albeit indirectly. Similarly, certain conservation programs pay farmland owners to, say, let land lay fallow or create wildlife habitat under the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. If any of Gates's acres are enrolled, he could receive government checks for keeping that land out of production. Moreover, farmland often enjoys lower property tax rates through use value assessment. Taxes are based on farming use, not full market value. A benefit that applies whether you're a family farmer or the richest person in the state. These structural perks mean that holding farmland is cost-efficient for big investors. Even the Environmental Working Group pointed out that many U.S. billionaires with large farms or ranches could be getting federal farm subsidies, but laws prevent disclosure of names. So we don't know if Gates's operations directly receive subsidies. The system is certainly favorable to large landowners. Beyond the balance sheet, Gates gains strategic advantages. By having a foot in the agricultural sector, he effectively hedges his bets on the future. If we consider global trends, climate change, population growth, shifting diets, many point to an increasing value of fertile land. Climate change may reduce the amount of arable land globally, due to desertification, sea level rise swallowing deltas, etc., potentially making remaining productive land more precious. Owning farmland in geographically diverse areas, Gates's land spans from Louisiana bayous to Midwestern plains, is a way to ensure against climate impacts too. Drought in one area might be offset by good yields in another. If worst-case scenarios play out, farmland could become the ultimate asset. People can forego a new smartphone in a crisis, but not food. Gates, ever the foresight-driven investor, likely sees farmland as a fundamental asset in a resource-constrained future. It's a bit like owning water rights or energy reserves, a hard asset that will be in demand no matter what technological disruptions occur, because we'll always need calories and nutrients. Additionally, owning farmland gives Gates leverage in shaping the future of agriculture and food, which we discussed as a possible goal. The benefit to him here is partly influence and partly the alignment of his investments. If he believes strongly that the world must shift how it produces and consumes food to be more sustainable, then by owning farmland he can be at the forefront of that shift and profit from it when it happens. For instance, if new high-yield, drought-tolerant crops become the norm, his farms could adopt them early and boost output, increasing the land's value. If carbon credits for regenerative farming become a lucrative business, paying farmers to sequester carbon in soils, he could enroll his land and reap payments for climate-friendly practices. It's not far-fetched. Companies are already exploring soil carbon offsets and sustainable certifications that might pay premiums to landowners. Gates's farms, managed sustainably, could earn such credits or premiums, effectively monetizing good practices. In that sense, Gates benefits by being perfectly positioned to capitalize on any green revolution in farming. He's not just investing in farmland for static return, likely expecting that innovation, perhaps driven by folks like himself, will make farmland even more productive and valuable in the future, and he wants to be holding a lot of it when that happens. We should also mention a simple benefit: diversification. Gates's portfolio is massive and varied, from tech companies to hotels to stocks and bonds. Farmland provides diversification into the real asset realm. Unlike urban real estate, farmland isn't as prone to bubbles or sudden crashes, and it doesn't correlate strongly with the fortunes of Microsoft or the stock market. So in terms of managing his 100+ billion, Farmland is a prudent choice to smooth out returns. It's the same reason pension funds and university endowments have started putting money into farmland. It's a solid physical asset with long-term appreciation that can weather storms and even pandemics. People still need groceries during a pandemic. Gates likely saw those benefits, and with the help of his financial managers like Michael Larson at Cascade, executed a plan to acquire prime agricultural land. While it was relatively underpriced, some of the big buys were around 2013 to 2017, when farmland had cooled off from a prior boom. In summary, Gates stands to gain financially from the consistent yields and rising values of farmland, enjoy systemic perks that land ownership brings, and strategically position himself in a sector that is crucial to humanity's future. If everything goes right, he makes money, advances technologies he cares about, and secures a legacy not just in tech, but in the very food we eat and the fields they grow in. It's a long-term play, matching his often long-term outlook on global issues. Whenever someone like Bill Gates starts buying vast tracts of land, it inevitably draws the gaze of regulators, lawmakers, and government agencies. In the case of his farmland acquisitions, governmental involvement has surfaced mainly around ensuring legal compliance and grappling with policy questions his landholdings raise. So far, we haven't seen direct government opposition to Gates's purchases, unlike the scrutiny over foreign entities buying farmland, but there have been a few notable intersections with public authorities. Firstly, as mentioned earlier, state laws can come into play. A vivid example is North Dakota. This state has a Depression-era law meant to protect family farms by banning corporations or trusts from owning farmland, with some exceptions. When a Gates-linked entity, Red River Trust, bought that potato farm in North Dakota, it triggered the state attorney general's office to investigate whether the purchase violated the anti-corporate farming statute. For a moment, it looked like an archaic law might derail Gates's ability to close the deal. The law, however, does allow an ownership loophole. If the land is leased back to actual farmers, a trust can own it. Gates's representatives assured the state that they would do exactly that, lease it to local potato growers, which made the purchase legal under the letter of the law. In July 2022, North Dakota Attorney General officially approved the sale after confirming it met the requirements, i.e., the land wouldn't be directly operated by a corporation, but by individual farmers as tenants. This episode highlights how Gates, or his investment team, navigated regulatory frameworks. They essentially structured ownership in a way that fits the rules, using a trust and committing to leasing, thus securing the land while technically complying with state law. Some might call it exploiting a loophole. Others might say it's following the law as written. Either way, the government had to get involved to scrutinize the purchase, and the situation shone a light on those old laws designed to keep farming local. North Dakota's agriculture commissioner noted that people were livid, and the AG himself acknowledged the public concern when he sent a query to the trust for more information. It's not every day the state government sends a letter effectively saying, "Dear Bill Gates, why do you want this land, and will you obey our law?" This leads to a broader point. The government is aware and watching these developments. At the federal level, as we saw, at least one congressman, representative, Dusty Johnson, took notice and took action. Johnson wrote a letter to the chair of the House Agriculture Committee urging that Bill Gates be called to testify in a hearing about his farmland ownership. In that letter, Johnson pointed out how substantial Gates's holdings are, cited the land report figure of 242,000 acres, and raised a policy-relevant question. Gates has advocated for synthetic beef to combat climate change. So what are his plans for all this farmland? Johnson essentially was saying Congress should at least ask Gates what he intends to do, given the potential implications for agriculture and food policy. Although, as of this writing, Gates has not actually been summoned to a public congressional hearing, the very fact that a lawmaker demanded it is remarkable. It underscores a level of governmental concern that U.S. farmland consolidation, even by an American billionaire, might warrant public scrutiny. Typically, we hear about Congress worrying over foreign ownership, like Chinese or Saudi buyers grabbing U.S. farmland for food security reasons. Now, Gates's domestic buying spree put a twist on that narrative. He's a U.S. citizen, but the sheer scale still raises a national interest question. The government's role here is partly oversight, ensuring no laws are broken, and partly potentially policy setting, deciding if any new rules are needed to address this kind of situation. So far, there's no special Bill Gates clause in any law, but one could imagine future legislation or state-level regulations emerging to cap how much land a single private entity can own, or to increase transparency in land sales. In some states like Iowa, they already ban non-resident individuals or companies from buying ag land in certain cases, though those laws have various exemptions. Gates's use of numerous LLCs and entities to buy land to keep purchases discreet also raises transparency issues. If investigative journalists hadn't dug through property records, the public might still not know the extent of Farmer Bill's holdings. Policymakers might consider requiring more disclosure on large land purchases. Congressional interest could also translate into changes in the Farm Bill, perhaps incentivizing sales to new farmers over investors, or tightening subsidy eligibility to ensure funds go to working farmers rather than passive landlords. These are conversations that groups like the National Young Farmers Coalition and others are actively having, especially with a once-in-5-year Farm Bill cycle always on the horizon. Another area of government intersection is subsidies and financing. If Gates's farms, or tenant farmers, receive federal farm payments or crop insurance payouts, that technically means taxpayer money is flowing into operations connected to him. Congress has debated means testing those subsidies, essentially trying to bar billionaires from benefiting. But as of now, crop insurance premium subsidies have no income cap. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, found many high-income farmers get these subsidies, but USDA is forbidden from revealing names. Some members of Congress would like to change that. It's conceivable that if political pressure grows, legislators might look at the phenomenon of billionaires as farmers and say, maybe we should ensure our farm programs are truly helping actual farmers in need, not just making it even more lucrative for the super rich to own land. On the flip side, if Gates's team is smart, and they are, they might be structuring leases so that the tenant farmers claim the subsidies, not the landowner. Still, the system indirectly benefits owners by reducing tenant risk. The American Farm Bureau or other farm interest groups might one day weigh in if they sense these dynamics are warping the playing field. In terms of regulatory advantages, Gates's vast resources mean he can hire top legal counsel to navigate any agricultural regulations, land use zoning, or environmental rules on his properties. Smaller farmers often complain about the burden of compliance with things like water regulations or land management rules. A large-scale owner can more easily absorb those costs or lobby for favorable interpretations. For example, if an environmental regulation required upgrading irrigation systems to save water, a billionaire owner could front that cost where a small farm might struggle. Gates hasn't been directly involved in any known legal battles over farm practices, but should any arise, say disputes over water rights or local land use permits, he'll be well equipped to handle them, which could give him an edge over smaller landowners in similar conflicts. One also wonders about policy influence via philanthropy. The Gates Foundation, while separate from his personal investments, does fund agricultural development programs globally, and Gates himself is influential in climate and sustainable development circles. He often interfaces with government leaders on these issues. His dual role as a thought leader in climate-friendly agriculture and as a big landowner could put him in a unique position to shape policies. For instance, if the USDA seeks input on climate-smart agriculture incentives, people will listen to Gates's perspectives, which might naturally align with protecting the value of his own farmland. For example, advocating for government support for soil carbon sequestration, a new revenue stream for landowners. This isn't to suggest corrupt intent, but simply that his positions and assets are intertwined. So far, there's no indication he's actively lobbying for policies that specifically advantage his land holdings, but the potential for influence is there. Finally, let's address one more governmental dimension: national security and food security. While Gates is a U.S. citizen, some argue that having so much of the food production base in any single, private hands could be a vulnerability. This is more an academic point now, but if, hypothetically, one owner controlled a significant share of a vital commodity, the government might worry about supply manipulation. Gates's share, around 0.03% of farmland, is far too low to threaten national food security on its own. But as a trend, if multiple tech billionaires followed suit, it might compel government attention to ensure competitive markets. Imagine if a handful of investors collectively owned, say, 10% of U.S. farmland. Antitrust or anti-monopoly concepts might enter the ag sphere. In conclusion, the government's involvement has so far been about monitoring and ensuring Gates's farmland acquisitions play by existing rules. North Dakota's review and a congressman's curiosity illustrate that this issue is on the radar. Gates has successfully navigated state restrictions by leasing to farmers, and there haven't been any moves to block his purchases outright. But the very fact that we're discussing should one person own this much land means it's touching a nerve in the public sector. Future farm policy might subtly shift to address consolidation of land ownership, whether it's through encouraging more ownership by actual farming families or adding transparency. Gates's farmland journey may prompt lawmakers to modernize those old laws and consider new ones. For now, Bill Gates legally owns his farmland empire, and government agencies are in the uncomfortable position of having to answer the public's questions. Is this okay? Do we need to change anything? In the end, the story of Bill Gates buying farmland is a window into the broader changes in our world, where tech money meets traditional agriculture, where private investment intersects with public interest. It raises valid questions about how we want our food system to function and who we want to control the resources that sustain us. Gates's venture into farmland could lead to positive innovation, or it could concentrate power in ways that society finds problematic. Most likely, it will be a bit of both. As we've explored, there are sensible reasons he's doing it: financial stability, a platform for ag tech, strategic foresight, and there are understandable reasons people are wary: consolidation, community impact, potential influence over food and policy. The full picture of why Bill Gates is buying farmland combines business savvy, futuristic thinking, and a dash of controversy. It's an evolving narrative, much like the crops that grow season after season on those very lands. And as that narrative unfolds, both the farming community and the public will be watching closely, sowing their own seeds of hope and concern about the harvest that Bill Gates's grand farmland experiment will ultimately yield.